if you're human, you know pain. It's everywhere, isn't it? Sickness, loss, violence, tragedy. It's unavoidable.
It really is, the universal human experience.
But for billions of people, especially those whose faith centers on a God who is supposedly, all-powerful and all good,
Yeah.
well, pain isn't just real. It's a huge paradox.
The ultimate paradox, you could say.
Right. How do you square that circle?
Yeah.
An absolutely sovereign, benevolent God and the sheer devastation we see in human suffering.
And that's the critical point, isn't it? Where theology hits the pavement, where belief meets raw reality.
Yeah.
It's probably the single most pastorally sensitive area, and dogmatically extremely complex. Philosophers call it the problem of evil, or theodicy.
But it's not just academic, is it? It's not some ivory tower debate.
Not at all. It's the question everyone whispers or shouts in the hospital waiting room, or looking at disaster footage, or, standing by a graveside.
It demands an answer, or at least a way to approach it that's, well, intellectually coherent, but also spiritually sustaining.
Exactly. You need both.
So today, that's what we're doing. We're going deep into the serious theological responses. Our mission, if you will, is to unpack two really big concepts. They get thrown around a lot, but we need precise definitions.
Okay. What are they?
First, divine providence, the whole idea that God is actually guiding and controlling things.
Right. The governance piece.
And second, redemptive suffering, this counterintuitive idea that maybe our pain isn't just waste, that it can be recycled for good.
A powerful and sometimes controversial idea.
Totally. So we're going to trace how these two concepts collide, right in the heart of that problem of evil. And crucially, we want to map out the big differences in how various Christian denominations try to answer that fundamental question. Is suffering ever truly wasted?
Yeah, the denominational angles are fascinating. The answers diverge quite sharply.
But first things first, we absolutely have to nail down these definitions. Because like you said, the arguments stack up, and if the foundation's shaky...
The whole thing comes down. You need precision. So, providence first.
Let's start there. Divine providence. When people hear that word, I think they often just think of, like, luck. Or maybe a happy coincidence.
Or maybe just God knowing what's going to happen. Foreknowledge.
Yeah, I was looking at the Latin root, provide. And it literally means to see forward, which sounds passive, like God's just watching the movie unfold.
Ah, but that's where the theological development is key. You're right, the root is about seeing ahead. But in theology, it evolved. It came to mean much more.
More active.
Much more active. We're definitely not talking about deism here. The idea that God just wound up the universe like a clock and then, walked away, left it running on its own.
Okay, so scrap the clockmaker image. What's the active definition then?
Divine providence, theologically, is God's active, ongoing, comprehensive intervention in the universe. It's his sovereign guidance and control over everything.
So back to that etymology from to see forward to something else.
It shifted to mean to supply what is needed, or even more powerfully, to see to it.
To see to it, that sounds purposeful, like taking responsibility.
Exactly. It's the difference between, say, knowing your final destination on a map and actually driving the bus to make sure it gets there. Providence means God isn't just a spectator. He's actively involved, sustaining and governing, moment by moment.
To ensure it reaches the end he planned.
The redemptive end, he has planned, yes.
Okay, the sources also break down how he governs. They talk about general providence and special providence. What's the difference there?
Think of general providence as the operating system, the continuous background maintenance. This is God upholding the natural order.
Like laws of physics, biology, gravity, the sun coming up.
Precisely. The regular, predictable functioning of the universe. It's the framework that keeps existence itself ticking along. Without it, chaos.
And special providence, that sounds more dramatic.
It usually is. That refers to God's direct, more recognizable interventions, things that step outside the usual laws of nature.
Miracles, answered prayer in a really obvious way.
Yes. Extraordinary actions that clearly shift the course of events. Think parting the Red Sea, or a specific healing that doctors can't explain. Both modes, general and special, together affirm God's complete and active engagement.
Right, but here's where it gets, well, potentially uncomfortable. And why it sets up the whole problem of evil we need to discuss. It's the scope of this control. It's not just the big stuff.
Ah, yes, the absolute nature of his sovereignty. That's the root of the tension, absolutely. We're not talking about God managing, the big picture, but letting the details sort themselves out.
No.
No. The tradition, especially in certain streams, insists on total control. For instance, you look at something like the Westminster Confession of Faith.
That's the 17th century Puritan framework, right?
Yeah.
Hugely influential in Reformed theology.
Exactly. And it states quite rigorously that God doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures' actions and things, from the greatest even to the least.
From the greatest even to the least.
Why his most wise and holy providence. It leaves nothing out.
So if God's directing empires and galaxies, he's also directing, I don't know, the stock market fluctuations, or my catching the flu, or even my own bad decisions.
That's the stark implication, yes. Nothing falls outside the perimeter of his ultimate will and governance. The sources often point to Matthew 10.
The sparrow passage.
Right. Not even a sparrow falls to the ground apart from his will.
That is meticulous control. Total.
It is. And, well, you can see the problem immediately, can't you? If God governs all actions right down to the falling sparrow.
Then the unavoidable question arises. Is God the author of sin? If he directs all actions, did he direct the evil actions that cause so much suffering?
The question that has, frankly, plagued theology for centuries. How do you maintain God's goodness if his control is that absolute?
So what's the traditional escape hatch? How does theology protect God's moral purity here?
The key mechanism offered is the doctrine of secondary causes.
Secondary causes. Okay, how does that work? How does it resolve this tension?
It works by proposing essentially two levels of causation happening simultaneously. God is the primary cause. He has ordained everything that will happen. He's the ultimate source of all reality and power.
Okay, primary cause. Got it.
But his typical way of working in the world is through secondary causes. He permits and governs the free choices of humans, choices for which they are morally responsible. He also governs the actions of fallen angels, Satan, and he governs the predictable operations of natural laws like, diseases or earthquakes.
So the human action or the natural event is real. It happens, but it's happening within or under God's overarching plan.
Exactly. The secondary cause is real, and the agent, if it's a person, is responsible for their intention. But that action remains subordinated to God's ultimate, sovereign, and always good purpose.
But isn't saying God permits evil just shifting the blame slightly? If he could stop it and doesn't, isn't he still involved in a way that's problematic? How do the sources push back on that?
They argue quite strongly that permission is not the same as authorship or endorsement. The crucial distinction lies in the intention of the agent versus the ultimate outcome governed by God.
Intention versus outcome. Can you give an example?
The classic scriptural illustration, the one always used here, is the story of Joseph in Genesis.
Right. His brothers sell him into slavery. Pretty evil act.
Absolutely malicious on their part. Joseph himself says to them later, "You meant evil against me." Their intention, the secondary cause, was undeniably wicked. But Joseph continues, "But God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today." God, the primary cause, used their evil action without approving of their malice to achieve his own redemptive purpose, saving Egypt and Jacob's family from famine.
So the human evil is real and culpable, but the divine governance redirects it, weaves it into a larger good plan.
That's the model. And what's fascinating, as you said earlier, is how this very comprehensive, high-definition view of providence inherently creates the problem of evil. It's so absolute, it demands a sophisticated answer to suffering.
Yeah, if God is truly driving the bus, you have to ask why he's taking it through such rough territory, through the wilderness, as you put it.
It's a closed system, logically. If God is all good and all-powerful and governs everything, and yet suffering undeniably exists within that system, well, the system has to account for it. Otherwise, the core claims about God's nature start to crumble.
Which brings us squarely to that collision point. Section 2. Providence meets the problem of evil, or theodicy. Let's unpack the attempts to justify God here.
Right. Theodicy, from the Greek. Theos, God, and deiko, justice. Literally, it's the attempt to justify God's ways to man, to vindicate his goodness and his providence despite the reality of evil and suffering.
And the philosophical core of this challenge has a famous name, doesn't it? The inconsistent triad.
That's the classic formulation. You find hints of it way back with Epicurus, but modern philosophers like J.L. Mackie really sharpened it. It lays out 3 statements about God that seem logically impossible to hold all at once, given the existence of evil.
What are the 3 points?
1, God is omnipotent. He's all-powerful, meaning he can prevent all evil.
Okay.
2, God is omnibenevolent. He's perfectly good, morally perfect, meaning he desires to eliminate all evil.
Makes sense.
3, evil exists, undeniably.
And the argument is,
The argument is simple. These 3 things can't all be true. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does evil persist? You have to give up one of the 3 points or show how they can actually coexist.
and this challenge breaks down further, doesn't it, into 2 kinds of problems.
Yes, philosophers distinguish between the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. They require slightly different responses.
Okay, what's the logical problem?
The logical problem is the more absolute deductive argument. It claims that the existence of a perfect God and the existence of any evil, even just one instance, are strictly logically incompatible, like trying to draw a square circle. If God is perfect, evil should be impossible, 0 tolerance.
But hasn't that argument largely been, well, diffused, particularly by one famous defense?
Yes, most philosophers agree that the free will defense, most associated with Alvin Plantinga, effectively answers the logical problem.
How does that work again?
It argues that it's logically possible that God's purpose included creating creatures with significant moral freedom, genuine free will. And it's possible that he could not create such creatures and guarantee that they would never choose evil. The value of genuine freedom might outweigh the risk of evil.
So a world with free creatures and the possibility of evil is logically compatible with a good God. It's not a strict contradiction anymore.
Exactly. It shows that God's existence and the existence of evil aren't necessarily logically incompatible.
Okay, so the logical problem is maybe diffused. But that leads to the second, and frankly, much tougher challenge, the one people feel more acutely.
Right. The evidential problem of evil. This is the argument that carries more weight for many people today.
How does it differ?
It basically says, okay, fine, maybe some evil is logically possible, maybe it's necessary for free will, we'll grant that. But, it argues, the sheer amount of evil we see, the horrific types of suffering, and the seemingly random distribution of it, all that makes the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God highly improbable.
So it's not about logical contradiction anymore, it's about evidence. The evidence of suffering seems to count against God's existence.
Precisely. They're not arguing against evil in the abstract. They point to concrete, horrific examples of what philosophers call gratuitous evil.
Gratuitous evil meaning pointless, unnecessary suffering.
Exactly. Suffering that seems to serve no discernible good purpose, moral or spiritual. It appears utterly senseless.
And the examples are always devastating.
They are. The sources consistently bring up the senseless suffering of a child, intense agony in someone too young to have sinned or to learn complex moral lessons from it. What possible good could that serve?
Or the other example mentioned, animal suffering.
Yeah.
Agonizing death through predation, disease, natural disasters happening for millions of years before humans even existed.
Right. If that suffering wasn't connected to human free will or sin, why did a good and powerful God design or permit a system with so much inherent pain built into it? That's the evidential challenge.
So theodicy then has to step up and try to offer morally sufficient reasons for why a good God permits that kind of apparently gratuitous evil.
Yes. It needs to show that even this horrific suffering might somehow fit into God's good plan.
What are the main philosophical strategies for doing that, the major theodicies?
Historically, theologians and philosophers have developed 3 main lines of argument, all trying to show that God allows pain because it's necessary for some greater identifiable good.
Okay, the first one.
The first is often called the higher order goods theodicy.
Higher order goods, meaning?
It argues that certain significant virtues or desirable states of being, logically, require the existence, or at least the possibility, of evil and suffering in order to exist themselves.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, think about courage. You can't really be courageous unless there's danger or adversity to face. Compassion requires witnessing suffering in others. Forgiveness requires that someone has actually done something wrong. Mercy requires need.
So God permits the lower order evil, danger, suffering, wrongdoing, to make possible the higher order good, courage, compassion, forgiveness.
That's the idea. The higher virtues we value most are, in a sense, responses to the darkness. Without the darkness, they couldn't shine.
Okay, that has a certain logic to it. What's the second major approach?
The second is the soul-building theodicy. This is often linked with the philosopher John Hick, though the idea is older.
Soul building, like moral development.
Exactly. Hick argued that God's purpose wasn't to create a comfortable, static paradise for humanity initially, like finished pets in a cage. Instead, He created a challenging environment, a kind of veil of soul-making.
A world designed for struggle.
Yes, a world where we face difficulties, temptations, and suffering precisely because these things are necessary for our moral and spiritual development. We grow from being naturally self-centered creatures towards becoming more virtuous, other-centered, resilient beings.
So suffering is like the grit that polishes the pearl. It's the necessary friction for character growth.
That's a good analogy. We
Oneself,
become
Dave.
better, stronger, more compassionate people because we had to navigate hardship, not in spite of it.
Okay. And the third category, it often involves sin and relationship.
Yes, the
Okay.
third is the punishment discipline theodicy. This one has a couple of facets.
Such as?
In its harder form, it sees some suffering as a direct, almost transactional consequence of sin, either personal sin or perhaps corporate societal sin. You reap what you sow, essentially.
That sounds a bit harsh, maybe.
It can, which is why the more common pastorally sensitive version frames it not as mere retribution, but as loving discipline from God as a father.
Ah, like a parent correcting a child for their own good.
Exactly. The sources point directly to Hebrews chapter 12, which says God disciplines those whom he loves. He disciplines us for our good that we may share his holiness. The idea is that God uses difficulties, sometimes painful ones, to correct us, purify us, and steer us back towards him when we stray.
So these three higher order goods, soul building and discipline, they offer philosophical or theological reasons why God might allow evil in general.
They attempt to provide a framework, yes, a rationale.
But, as we touched on earlier, these philosophical arguments, while maybe intellectually interesting, often fall flat pastorally, don't they?
They really can. Telling someone in the midst of terrible pain that their suffering is necessary for someone else's compassion, or that it's soul-building, it can feel incredibly cold, abstract, and dismissive of their actual agony.
Yeah, it doesn't always land well.
And often, these theodicies end up falling back on the inscrutability defense. Ultimately, we just can't know God's specific reasons, we just have to trust him. Which is an element of faith, absolutely, but it doesn't resolve the intellectual and spiritual anguish of feeling like your suffering is meaningless.
Right, doesn't answer the why me in
Yeah.
a satisfying way.
No. And that's precisely why we need to move beyond these general philosophical justifications to the specifically Christian doctrine that tackles the problem of apparently gratuitous evil head-on by claiming it can be given explicit meaning and purpose.
Okay, so let's dive into section 3. Redemptive suffering as a kind of participatory theodicy. Define this for us.
Redemptive suffering is the distinctively Christian belief held strongly in some traditions, less so or differently in others, that human suffering, when it's consciously accepted, embraced, and deliberately offered up in union with the passion of Jesus Christ, can actually serve a spiritual purpose.
A spiritual purpose
Like contributing to the remission of the temporal punishment due to sin, either one's own sins or the sins of others. Or it can be offered for other specific spiritual or even physical needs within the community of faith, the church.
Okay, we need to immediately put up a big flashing warning sign here, right?
Ah.
This does not mean that your suffering earns you forgiveness or merits salvation itself.
Absolutely. Critical distinction. Forgiveness and salvation are always understood as free gifts of God's grace, accomplished definitively by Christ on the cross. Redemptive suffering isn't about earning that grace.
So what is it about then?
It's understood as a participation in the application of Christ's already finished work. It operates within the economy of grace established by Christ's redemption. It doesn't add to the redemption itself.
Okay, participation and application. That's a key phrase. How does this idea transform the meaning of pain itself?
It fundamentally shifts the perspective.
Yeah.
Suffering is acknowledged as, yes, an often terrible consequence of the brokenness of the world, the sin of the world that affects everyone. It's part of the human condition after the fall. But the claim is that Christ, by entering into suffering himself supremely on the cross, didn't just endure it. He transformed it. He turned it from potentially meaningless, destructive evil into something else entirely.
Into what?
Into, as the sources put it, a potential divine rescue and an invitation from our Lord to enter into his passion. He essentially opened up a way for our suffering to be connected to his and thereby gain his redemptive power.
And this is the direct answer to that evidential problem of evil, the challenge of gratuitous, pointless suffering.
Precisely. If the philosopher's challenge hinges on the existence of suffering that serves no good purpose, the doctrine of redemptive suffering denies the premise. It asserts that no suffering, once it is consciously united to Christ's suffering, is ever pointless or wasted. It is immediately infused with redemptive potential.
That's a bold claim.
It's a very bold claim, and it's why this approach often resonates pastorally in a way that abstract philosophy sometimes doesn't.
Oh.
Because it doesn't necessarily try to give you the specific, backward-looking reason why this particular bad thing happened to you. Often, we simply can't know that.
Which can be frustrating.
It can, but instead of focusing on the unknowable origin, redemptive suffering focuses on the future potential. It provides a proactive, forward-looking mechanism for what you can do with the pain now that it's here.
Ah, so it shifts the question.
Completely. It moves from, why did this happen, which might be unanswerable, to, okay, this has happened, now how can I offer this to God? What good can he bring out of this if I unite it with Christ?
That does seem to grant the sufferer kind of agency, doesn't it? You're not just passively enduring something meaningless.
Exactly. You're not merely a victim of circumstance or biology or someone else's malice. By choosing to offer it up, you become an active participant in God's ongoing work of redemption. You're taking the very weapon the enemy is using against you and turning it into an instrument for grace.
Okay, so how does this transformation actually work? What's the mechanism? You mentioned it requires both a human element and a divine element.
That's right. Let's start with the human prerequisite. The first step, according to the sources, is an act of the will. Abandonment to divine providence.
Abandonment, like surrender.
Yes, but an active, trustful surrender. It's consciously choosing to accept the reality of the pain, not necessarily liking it or wanting it, but accepting that it exists within the sphere of God's permissive or directive will. Believing that even this is somehow held within the hands of a loving, sovereign God.
So it's accepting the what is without necessarily understanding the why.
Precisely. It's that trustful surrender the sources mention. It requires believing in God's ultimate goodness and power no matter what. The sources call this an act of pure faith.
And what does that surrender achieve for the sufferer?
Psychologically and spiritually, it can be liberating. It frees the believer from the additional suffering that comes from bitterness, resentment, and, as one source puts it, resisting the Almighty. You stop fighting the reality of the pain itself, even while you might still fight its cause, like fighting a disease. You accept its presence and trust God has a purpose for it.
Okay, so that human act of surrender, of abandonment, prepares the ground. What's the divine action that meets it?
The divine action is rooted in the nature of Christ's work itself. Pope John Paul II, in his 1984 letter Salvifici Doloris, which means on the salvific meaning of suffering, provided a really influential modern articulation of this.
What was his key insight?
His central point, which echoes centuries of tradition, is that while Christ's redemption, achieved on the cross, was objectively complete and sufficient for all time, he paradoxically did not bring it to a close.
Complete but not close. That sounds, well, paradoxical. What does that mean?
It means that the work of redemption is finished, a price is paid, but the application of that redemption throughout history is ongoing. John Paul II says Christ, in his resurrection and through the sending of the Holy Spirit, opened his suffering to man.
Open his suffering. Like an invitation.
Exactly, an invitation to participate. He didn't just save us from something, he saved us for something, participation in his own divine life and mission. He established the church, which theology calls the mystical body of Christ, as the ongoing presence of his life in the world.
The mystical body. So the church isn't just an organization, it's seen as a living extension of Christ himself.
In this theological view, yes, it's an organic reality. Christ is the head, believers are the members. And just as pain in one part of your physical body affects the whole, the suffering of the members can be united with the suffering of the head.
So when a believer accepts their suffering and offers it in union with Christ's sacrifice, what's happening theologically?
They are, in a sense, allowing their own life, their own pain, to become a channel through which the grace won on the cross can flow into the world today. They aren't adding to the infinite value of the cross.
All right, we established that.
But they are participating in its distribution. Their suffering becomes a way that the objective redemption becomes subjectively real and effective for themselves or for others they offer it for. It's like that. The central power plant is the cross, but individual sufferers who unite with it become like transformers or power lines, delivering that energy to specific places.
It's a decent analogy, yes. It highlights the participatory aspect.
And this all ties back to providence, how?
It's the ultimate expression of providence as divine recycling. Remember, providence means God sees to it that his plan succeeds governing all things. This doctrine claims that God's governance is so complete that it takes even the worst things, sin, evil, suffering, death things, he permits but does not desire in themselves, and ensures they are not wasted. He recycles them, weaves them back into his ultimate redemptive purpose.
Nothing is ultimately meaningless in his plan.
That's the claim. Even the very results of evil are harnessed for the triumph of good.
And the ultimate template for this, the proof of concept, is the cross itself.
Absolutely. The crucifixion was, from a human perspective, the greatest possible evil. The betrayal, torture, and execution of the innocent Son of God, a monstrous injustice.
Yet, through God's sovereign providential plan, that supreme act of evil was turned into the supreme act of good. The atonement for the sins of the world, the source of salvation for all humanity. God recycled the worst thing into the best thing.
And redemptive suffering theology essentially says that this same pattern, this same transformative recycling power, is now available to all who are united to Christ in his body.
Yes. It claims that if believers consciously unite their unavoidable sufferings with the cross, their pain gains supernatural value, participates in that great victory, and finds its ultimate meaning and purpose within God's providential plan.
Okay. We've laid out the high view of providence and the mechanism of redemptive suffering as a way to make sense of pain within that framework. Powerful stuff.
Okay, it is.
But this is where unified Christian thought hits a major fork in the road, isn't it? Because not all Christians understand this the same way or even accept it.
Not at all. The disagreements are profound, and they stem from very deep-seated theological differences.
So let's get into section 4. The scriptural and denominational fault lines. There's one particular verse that seems to be the epicenter of this earthquake.
There is. If you want to understand the core disagreement, you have to wrestle with Colossians chapter 1, verse 24.
What does Paul say there?
The Apostle Paul writes this: "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I complete what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is, the church."
Okay, let that sink in. I complete what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. That sounds stunning. Maybe even problematic.
It's arguably one of the most debated, potentially shocking verses in the New Testament for exactly that reason. How can anything be lacking in the suffering of Christ, whose work is supposed to be perfect, complete, and sufficient?
Yeah, it seems to fly in the face of basic Christian doctrine about the atonement.
And that single phrase, what is lacking, hysteromata in Greek, becomes the interpretive battleground. How you understand that determines your whole theology of suffering.
So let's look at the main camps. Interpretation 1 is the view we've sort of been describing, often associated with Roman Catholicism. How do they handle lacking?
They start by absolutely affirming that Christ's sacrifice on the cross was objectively complete. It had infinite value, sufficient to save the whole world. There's no deficiency in the merit itself. That's non-negotiable.
Okay, so the lack isn't in the value of the sacrifice.
Yep.
Then what is lacking?
What's lacking in this view is the subjective application of those infinite merits to individual souls throughout history in the concrete circumstances of their lives.
So the treasure chest is full, infinitely full, but the treasure needs to be distributed, delivered to people.
That's the idea. The objective redemption needs to be made subjectively effective, and Paul's suffering, and by extension the suffering of any believer united to Christ, acts as a kind of conduit, a vehicle, as one source puts it, for conveying the passion to the hearts and souls of men.
So the suffering of the church members helps apply the salvation Christ won. It brings completeness not to the atonement itself, but to its reach in the world.
Exactly, completeness in an external applicative way. The body, the church, participates in distributing the merits won by the head, Christ.
Is there a related view within Catholicism that also fits here? Something about the total suffering of the mystical body?
Yes, there's a complementary interpretation found in some church fathers and later theologians. They understand Christ's afflictions not just as the suffering Jesus endured historically, but as the total sum of suffering appointed for the entire mystical body, head, and members together throughout all of history until the end times.
So Christ endured his part, the primary part, but the members still have their share to endure to fill up the total measure of suffering destined for the body.
That's the concept. It's like a preordained quota of suffering for the whole Christ head and body, and each member contributes their part over time.
Okay, that's interpretation 1. Subjective application or filling up the body's quota. Now let's shift dramatically to interpretation 2. The Protestant view. How do they approach Colossians 1.24, given their strong emphasis on sola fide, faith alone, and the absolute sufficiency of Christ's finished work on the cross.
Well, as you'd expect, they strenuously, absolutely reject any interpretation that could even hint that Christ's atonement was deficient or needs human suffering added to it to make it effective for salvation. That's a red line.
So how do they explain Paul saying he completes what is lacking?
The most common and influential view, especially in modern evangelical circles, people like John Piper have championed this, is what's called the apostolic presentation view.
Apostolic presentation. What's being presented?
The gospel, the message of the atonement. They argue that what is lacking is not something in the atonement itself, but in the presentation or proclamation of that finished atonement to the world, particularly to the Gentiles, whom Paul was called to reach.
So Paul's sufferings, his imprisonments, beatings, shipwrecks, all his hardships weren't adding merit to the cross. They were the necessary cost of getting the message out.
Exactly. They argue Paul is saying, there's a certain measure of suffering that the apostles must endure in order to fulfill the Great Commission, to spread the gospel to all nations. My suffering is filling up that necessary quota of missionary hardship for the sake of the church's growth and outreach.
So it's suffering for the church's mission, not suffering that mechanically applies grace. It's about proclamation, not participation in redemption itself.
That's the core distinction. It's about demonstrating the value and cost of the gospel message to the world, not about being a channel for saving grace.
Is there a simpler Protestant view as well?
Yes, a very common understanding, which aligns well with the theodicies we discussed earlier, is the sanctification view. This interprets Paul's suffering, and all Christian suffering, primarily as a tool God uses for the believer's own spiritual growth, conforming them more into the moral image of Christ, making them holier.
So suffering makes you better. It doesn't directly help others get saved in a mechanistic way.
Right. It's about personal holiness and character refinement, fitting with the discipline or soul-building models.
Wow. That difference is the suffering about applying grace, Catholic, or proclaiming the message, Protestant. Really explains the massive divergence we see in how different traditions approach pain.
It absolutely does. It leads directly into the distinct spiritualities of suffering across the major branches of Christianity.
Let's use that framework then. Let's compare the 4 traditions highlighted in the sources. First, Roman Catholicism. What's their characteristic approach?
As we've discussed, their view centers on participatory redemption. The emphasis is very practical, devotional. Believers are actively encouraged to consciously offer up their sufferings, big or small, as a spiritual sacrifice, uniting it with Christ's sacrifice, especially as represented in the Mass.
And the purpose of offering it up is?
It's seen as a way to cooperate with grace, potentially obtaining specific spiritual benefits, maybe strength for oneself, conversion for a loved one, relief for souls in purgatory, support for the church's mission. There's a sense of active, communal, spiritual transaction participation in the flow of grace.
Okay. Second, Eastern Orthodoxy. How do they differ?
Their emphasis is less on participation in redemption and more on theosis, which means deification or becoming like God. Suffering, especially within an ascetic context, like fasting or enduring hardship patiently, is viewed as a means of purification.
Purification for what?
Purification from passions and sin, allowing the believer to participate more fully in the divine life, to become by grace what God is by nature. It's part of a transformative journey toward spiritual health and communion with God.
Do they talk about offering it up for others in the same way?
Generally, no. They tend to be wary of the Western Catholic framework of merits, satisfaction, and temporal punishment, seeing it as too legalistic or transactional, like spiritual accounting. For Orthodoxy, suffering is more about the path to healing and transformation than about settling debts.
Got it. Third, Reformed Protestantism, like Presbyterianism, Calvinism.
Given their strong emphasis on God's absolute sovereignty and the finished work of Christ, suffering is primarily understood in 2 ways. Divine discipline, God correcting and training his children out of love, as per Hebrews 12.
Okay, like the fatherly discipline idea.
Yes. And secondly, as a means of sanctification, God using hardship to test faith, build character, and make the believer more holy, more like Christ. The purpose is the believer's growth and God's glory, possibly also achieving justice externally in the world, but definitely not adding to the atonement or being offered up as a sacrifice for merits.
So its value is primarily for the individual's relationship with God and their moral state.
Primarily, yes, and for demonstrating faith under pressure.
And finally, Lutheranism. How does their approach fit?
Lutherans operate under what they call the theology of the cross, Theologia Crucis. They're perhaps the most suspicious of the traditions regarding the Catholic practice of offering it up,
Why so suspicious?
Because anything that looks like a human work contributing to salvation or dealing with sin is seen as undermining solidified the doctrine that we are saved by faith alone, through grace alone, because of Christ alone. Offering up suffering sounds too much like trying to earn something or contribute merit.
So what is suffering for Lutherans then?
Christ's suffering is the only truly redemptive suffering. Our suffering is simply part of the cross we bear as followers of a crucified Lord. It's something to be endured by faith, trusting in God even when he seems hidden or paradoxical in the midst of pain. It's not a sacrifice we offer, but a burden we carry, clinging to Christ's promises.
So for Lutherans, faith in the midst of suffering rather than the offering of suffering itself is key.
Precisely. Faith trusting God despite the suffering, not using suffering as a tool.
It's really striking. The same reality, human pain viewed through these different theological prisms, results in vastly different understandings and practices.
It really underscores that the arguments about redemptive suffering are often surface expressions of much deeper disagreements about salvation, grace, and the very nature of the church.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we've explored the internal Christian debates, but we also need to acknowledge, in Section 5, the critiques that come from outside this theological framework. How is this whole concept viewed from modern critical perspectives?
That's important, yes, because the doctrine doesn't exist in a vacuum. One major challenge is the secular medical critique.
How does that go?
It basically points out that our modern Western culture is overwhelmingly focused on eliminating pain and suffering. Health means the absence of illness. Progress means increasing comfort and longevity. Medicine's goal is to cure or palliate.
Right, we see suffering as a problem to be solved, ideally eliminated.
Exactly. So from that perspective, the idea of finding spiritual meaning or growth through enduring suffering, let alone offering it up, can seem completely outdated or even ridiculous, as one source puts it. It clashes fundamentally with the modern therapeutic technological mindset. Why embrace pain when you can take a pill or have surgery?
That makes sense. Then there's a more pointed ethical critique, the feminist critique. This one raises concerns about potential misuse.
Yes, this is a very serious concern. Some feminist theologians and ethicists argue that assigning salvific meaning to suffering, especially passive endurance, can inadvertently glorify victimhood.
How so?
The worry is that this doctrine could be, and perhaps has been, used as a tool to keep oppressed people historically, often women in situations of domestic abuse, or other marginalized groups facing systemic injustice, passive and resigned to their suffering. If your pain is automatically redemptive, why fight to change the unjust situation causing it?
That's a powerful charge. Does the doctrine have safeguards against that?
Proponents would argue that the doctrine, properly understood, applies primarily to unavoidable suffering, like terminal illness, natural disasters, irrevocable loss, and shouldn't be used to justify complacency in the face of preventable injustice. One should always fight injustice and alleviate suffering where possible, but the critique remains potent as a warning against misapplication.
A crucial distinction. What other critiques are there?
Well, there's the simple, raw, experiential critique. This loops back to the problem of gratuitous evil.
The senseless suffering of a child, example again.
Yes, or other forms of extreme, seemingly pointless agony. For critics looking from the outside, theological concepts develop to handle this, like the idea of victim souls, rare individuals who supposedly embrace immense suffering specifically for the salvation of others, can make God appear, frankly, monstrous or sadistic. It seems to instrumentalize innocent pain for an abstract spiritual economy.
That visceral reaction, what kind of God would allow that, is hard to overcome intellectually for many.
Very hard. And finally, underlying many of these critiques is the fundamental critique of supernaturalism.
Meaning?
Meaning the entire concept of redemptive suffering, offering pain to remit temporal punishment for sin, participating in Christ's mystical body, channeling grace, is completely dependent on a supernatural worldview that many modern people simply don't share.
If you don't believe in original sin, or the unique divinity of Christ, or the idea of a spiritual battle, or the church as a mystical body.
And the whole doctrine becomes unintelligible, empirically unbelievable, as one source says. It just doesn't make sense outside of its specific theological ecosystem. It requires buy-in to a whole set of prior beliefs.
Okay, so we've seen the internal debates and the external critiques. Let's try to synthesize this. We started with providence as the guarantee, redemptive suffering as the mechanism within that. The disagreements and critiques seem to boil down to a few really fundamental divides in Christian thought.
That's a good way to summarize it. The sources suggest the specific arguments over redemptive suffering are really just symptoms of three deeper foundational divergences. Understanding these three helps make sense of the whole landscape.
What's the first one?
The first is soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. How are we saved?
And the split is?
The split is essentially between salvation understood as involving human cooperation in applying God's grace, the Catholic and Orthodox view, which allows room for participatory suffering, versus salvation understood as a forensic declaration by God, received by faith alone, the classic Protestant view.
Remind us what forensic declaration means again, simply.
Forensic means legal. God declares the believer righteous in his sight, like a judge issuing a verdict based on Christ's work. It's primarily an external status change imputed to the believer.
As opposed to an internal transformation being the primary mechanism?
Well, transformation follows, but the basis of salvation is the declaration. If salvation is primarily forensic and received solely by faith, then human suffering logically cannot contribute to the mechanics of salvation itself. It must have a different purpose, like discipline or sanctification.
Okay, so soteriology is divide number one. What's number two?
Number two is ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church. What is the church?
And the divergence here.
Is the church fundamentally an ontological mystical body, a real organic extension of Christ's own life and reality in the world? If yes, the high view found in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, then it makes sense that the members can participate in the life, including the suffering of the head.
And the alternative view.
Or is the church primarily an assembly of individual believers gathered for worship and fellowship, acting mainly as agents for proclaiming the gospel message, a common Protestant understanding? If it's primarily an assembly for proclamation, then suffering logically relates more to the mission of proclaiming than to the internal mechanics of applying grace.
That makes sense. Soteriology, ecclesiology. What's the third foundational divide?
The third is very practical, exegesis. Specifically, the interpretation of that key verse, Colossians 1:24.
What is lacking in Christ's afflictions?
Exactly. Does lacking refer to the subjective application of Christ's infinite merits, requiring the church's participation, or does it refer to the quota of apostolic proclamation suffering needed to spread the gospel? Your answer to that exegetical question locks you into one camp or the other.
So those three, how salvation works, what the church is, and how you read that one verse, pretty much determine your whole stance on whether and how suffering can be redemptive.
They really form the deep structure of the different approaches.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we began with this incredibly high view of divine providence, God's absolute sovereignty, his promise to see to it that his plan succeeds.
Yes, the guarantee that he's in control, governing everything from the greatest to the least.
And the doctrine of redemptive suffering, in its various forms, emerges as perhaps the ultimate theological expression of that providence. It's the mechanism that ensures, within that worldview, that absolutely nothing, no tragedy, no pain, no evil act, ultimately falls outside God's power to redeem and repurpose.
It's the claim that the divine recycler, as you called it, is always at work, ensuring no suffering is ever truly wasted or meaningless for those within his plan.
So for you listening, what's the final takeaway here? We've seen that the mechanisms proposed differ wildly: Catholic participation, Orthodox theosis, Protestant discipline, and sanctification. Very different paths.
Radically different in some ways.
But beneath those differences lies a shared core Christian conviction that because of God's personal, purposeful providence, rooted in the work of Christ, suffering and evil for the believer do not get the final word. Meaning can be found, purpose can be established, even in the darkest times. It's never just random noise.
That's the underlying hope offered across the traditions, despite their interpretive differences. God remains sovereign and good, working all things together for good for those who love him, even the hard things.
Now, as we close, there's one last provocative thought from the sources that's worth chewing on. It relates to God's own nature.
Ah, you mean the doctrine of divine impassibility.
Exactly. The classical theological idea that God, in his divine essence, does not experience emotion or pain or change caused by the created world. He is perfect, complete, unchanging.
Which, on the surface, seems to create a massive gulf between God and human suffering, right? If God cannot suffer, how can he possibly understand or relate to our pain? It makes him seem distant, aloof.
A potential disconnect. But Christian theology has a specific answer to bridge that chasm, doesn't it?
It does. The incarnation. The doctrine asserts that God does experience suffering, profoundly so, but not by changing his immutable divine nature. Instead, he takes on human nature in the person of Jesus Christ.
So, God the Son experiences betrayal, torture, and death, in his assumed humanity, while his divine nature remains impassible.
That's the classical understanding. He enters into suffering by joining us in our condition, not by diminishing his divinity.
Okay, so here's the closing question to ponder, sparked by that idea. How does the active, purposeful governance of this impassible God, who chooses to enter suffering by becoming human, ultimately differ in its meaning and implication from the passive, indifferent governance of, say, an impersonal fate or deterministic natural laws, given that both seem to allow immense pain?
That's the profound question. If both systems permit suffering, what makes the Christian framework different? Proponents would point to the choice inherent in the incarnation. It wasn't necessitated. It was a free act of love and solidarity. God didn't remain aloof. He entered the arena.
So the difference lies not just in the permission of pain, but in the divine response to it, the choice to share it.
Precisely. Is suffering just a brute fact under an indifferent cosmos, or is it something that God himself has entered into, wrestled with, and ultimately promises to redeem? That's the question the incarnation forces us to consider, something to take with you.